So today we're doing something fun. One of the things about the Christmas season are the wonderful Christmas songs, like the Christmas song, chestnuts roasting by the open fire, that song. Well, it occurred to me, I have never in my life even seen a chestnut. I have no idea what they taste like. I have never roasted one ever. So we're going to try it. Coming up next. Hi everybody, my name is Dee Burks, and part of living a great retirement is sometimes trying things you've never tried before. I think as we get older, all of us are much more interested in our histories and where we came from. And one of those things that I'm interested in are those Christmas traditions. Well, there are a couple of Christmas songs that I noticed that reference chestnuts. And for those of you not in the U.S., and I know a lot of European people watch this channel, chestnuts aren't common in the U.S. anymore. Back in the day, in the late 1800s, 1900, turn of the century, they were very, very common, but they're not anymore. What happened was the American chestnut, which grew all up and down the East Coast, was very common. Billions of chestnut trees. They were everywhere, y'all. They were used for furniture, for housing. The early settlers actually survived on them in a lot of cases. Wildlife survived on them. Farm animals were fed chestnuts. They were everywhere. Well, in the very early 1900s, the Japanese chestnut tree was introduced to the U.S. and it brought with it a chestnut blight that the American chestnut tree was not resistant to. And over the next 50 years or so, it basically killed all the American chestnut trees. They were considered functionally extinct. What that means is this blight would kill the entire upper portion of the tree all the way down to the ground. Now the roots would still be alive and they would sprout new chestnut trees. But those chestnut trees would then get the blight and die too. So they have been functionally extinct in the U.S. since the 1950s, 60s. There were very, very few surviving chestnut trees. Well, what that means is that people who were born, all the baby boomers who were born after World War II, they did not grow up with chestnuts as their parents and grandparents and everyone else in the U.S. had. So you now have multiple generations of people who've never even seen a chestnut, have never tasted one, don't know what that is. Well, this year I decided, you know what, I'm going to find out. Over the last 10 years or so, they've been developing varieties of the American chestnut tree that hopefully are much more resistant to this blight. And so there are now some orchards, especially on the East Coast, like in the Appalachia region, where chestnuts used to be so common. There are now some orchards that are producing chestnut trees. So I ordered some. And this is what I got. I ordered them from virginiachestnuts.com. They did not send these to me. I didn't ask them to send them to me. I ordered them and paid for them just like you would. I also got the little tool, and I'll explain this little tool here in a minute. And I'm so glad I did. But I ordered some chestnuts. So this is my first exposure to ever having even seen a chestnut. Now you may be wondering, as I was, why don't we see chestnuts in the grocery store? Well, one of the reasons is, number one, they're not that common in the U.S. anymore. But the main reason is they are much more perishable than your regular nuts like pecans or hazelnuts or anything like that. Chestnuts have this soft, leathery type of covering. And chestnuts are mostly carbohydrate. They're only about 4 to 6% fat, but it makes them very perishable. They need to be kept moist. And for those of us who live in the southwestern part of the U.S., there's nothing moist out here, y'all. Nothing. So chestnuts aren't going to make it out here. And even shipping them out here is kind of a concern because they dry out so quickly. And once they're dried out, they're not any good. But chestnuts also in a humid environment can rot really easily. So they're very, very perishable. So what about those Christmas songs, right? Well, the Christmas song itself was written in 1945, shortly after World War II, toward the end of it actually. And it was written by Mel Torme and another writer. But you've got to remember the people who wrote these classic Christmas songs, a lot of them were written in the 1940s after World War II. People were feeling very nostalgic toward Christmas. And when they were kids, in the 20s and teens, 19 teens, chestnuts were everywhere. So that's what they wrote about, even though by that time they were relatively rare. But they were writing nostalgic Christmas songs of their childhoods. That's why they're in the songs. It was a big deal. There were chestnuts roasting on every street corner back then. And now they're just not. The second song that I really noticed including chestnuts was the Sleigh Ride song. It was originally recorded by the Andrews Sisters, again, 1948, shortly after World War II. And it talked about taking a sleigh ride. And there's a line in the song that talks about they'll be sitting by the fire watching the chestnuts roast, pop, pop, pop. I so didn't get that. I'm like, pop, pop, what? What is that? Nuts don't pop. Chestnuts do. One of the things about chestnuts, and one of the reasons this tool I got was so important, is you have to cut through this leathery skin they have, because when they roast, they expand. And if you don't cut the shell, they explode. Thus the pop, pop, pop. Totally confused on that, but now I get it. So I went out and I looked at numerous YouTube videos on how to roast chestnuts. I've never seen it done, never tried it. And what I did was I cut through the leathery shell with this tool. You can use a knife or a pair of shears too, but given my history with knives in the kitchen, I would have cut my fingers off. So I'm really glad I got the tool, and I certainly suggest you do as well. But I cut them and then I soaked them for 2 hours in water. Having that moisture is really important. And let's talk about this for a sec. For those of us who live in the South, and pecans are the ubiquitous nut in the South, right? You know how pecans will have a hard outer shell, but then they'll also have that really papery inner lining that is super bitter. Ugh. It's awful if you don't get all that stuff off, right? Chestnuts do too. They have this leathery outer shell that you cut through, but they also have this really lightweight, papery inner shell, and if you don't get all that off the chestnut, it's really bitter, kind of like pecans. So one of the ways you ensure you're going to get that off is to be sure that nut has lots of moisture. Then when the nut opens up, and it will naturally open up so you can peel it, in the oven, or if you're roasting it over the fire, it will open up and that paper shell will release and you can get the chestnut out clean. Now, one of the things I saw on YouTube as far as how to really peel chestnuts effectively was to, as soon as they come out of the oven or off the heat, whatever you're using, that you wrap them in a wet dish towel for about 5 minutes. Number one, this cools them down where you can actually handle them without burning your fingers. And number two, it allows that steam to help that inner shell release. And then you can easily peel them. They pop right out, and they are delicious. I have to say, I can totally see why these were a thing historically. They are absolutely delicious. They taste somewhere like a really mild macadamia or hazelnut, just a really, really mild flavor. They're also very filling. So it doesn't take many of them for you to get full. And one thing to remember about chestnuts is if you overcook them and they get hard, oh man, it's like a rock. In fact, because I did get full really quick, I had the bright idea that I would take these other chestnuts that I had roasted already and chop them up and put them into chocolate chip cookies because, you know, the flavor was somewhat similar to macadamia nuts. So I thought, hey, that'll be tasty together. Well, when you expose them to heat again, guess what? They're like little teeny hard rocks. It's like making chocolate chip cookies with gravel in them. Please don't do that. Ugh. But one of the things that you can do with chestnuts, besides eating them immediately, which is when they're absolutely the best, is once you roast them, you can actually grind them into a flour. Because they are a lower fat nut, per ounce, there's less than 40 calories per ounce. And just to compare, per ounce on cashews, there is 150 calories plus on a cashew. But with chestnuts, it's less than 40. So you get a much bigger calorie saving. And the flavor is great. It's really mild, so it's perfect for a flour. If you want to grind it into a flour at that point, you can. I also saw videos where they make pasta, they add it to beer. They make a really great chestnut beer. That was a European video. There are a lot of videos out there that show how Europeans use chestnuts. And for those of us who have now had generations of people who have no clue what a chestnut is in America, those are great resources because that's something we would not have had access to. Now, it's not that our people didn't at one point use chestnuts just as part of their everyday life. They did. Even though several generations of my family are from Texas, they originally came to Texas from Tennessee, from that Appalachia region in the mountains. They were mountain people, and they came after the Civil War. So they were used to chestnuts being everywhere, and they just didn't exist out here in this part of the country. So all those recipes and knowledge of what to do with chestnuts really disappeared. So it's really nice to get that back, to understand the historical significance of chestnuts and how they played into early settler life, but also just to taste one. You know, and here again, I think once we get toward retirement and we're more interested in those sorts of historical things, doing something like roasting chestnuts is great fun. And what a fabulous thing to expose your grandchildren to. How else are they going to be exposed to that? It's going to be a long time before chestnuts once again are common in the U.S. So this is a great fun thing to do with your family, with your grandkids, and then they'll understand what those old-fashioned traditional Christmas songs really mean. Now, if you've enjoyed this video, please click subscribe, and I'll see you next time.